The day the party lost its teacher. April 30th in Mexico is no ordinary day. It's Children's Day, and in the country's elementary schools, that date holds an almost sacred significance. Classrooms are transformed, playgrounds fill with colorful tissue paper, teachers arrive in costumes or patterned shirts they wouldn't wear anywhere else, and the children know about it days in advance. They talk about it at home, anticipating it with that boundless energy that only childhood possesses when something good is guaranteed. At the Benito Juarez Federal Elementary School, located in the Cervantes neighborhood of the city of Guanajuato, April 30th, 2023, began exactly like this. With yellow and green balloons hanging from the arches of the central courtyard, with a long table covered in colorful jellies and traditional sweets, with the principal, Mrs. Esperanza Villanueva, reviewing the day's program since 7 in the morning, with that mix of enthusiasm and anxiety that characterized her every time the school had an event. Rodrigo Castellanos Peña arrived at 7:40 a.m. He was 37 years old, had been teaching at that school for 9 years, and was, by any informal measure the parents could offer, one of the most beloved teachers on the campus. It wasn't the kind of affection earned through leniency or gifts. It was the affection built on genuine presence, on the teacher who remembers the name of every student's younger sibling, who notices when a child arrives quietly on a Monday and approaches to ask how their weekend was. That morning he arrived wearing a navy blue t-shirt that read, "Happy Children's Day," in yellow letters, and carrying a plastic bag that contained, as he told his colleague Fernanda Rios as they entered together through the side door, 28 little bags of churritos with chamoy that he had prepared the night before. One per student, none without theirs. Fernanda looked at him with a weary smile and told him it was too much for a teacher who, on top of that, had to teach a class at 8. Rodrigo shrugged and replied that that was what Children's Day was for, to do what you wouldn't normally do. The party began at 10 in the morning in the central courtyard. The groups filed out of their classrooms in order, led by their respective teachers, and the third grade B students came running, even though they had been asked to walk. Rodrigo followed them without hurrying, his hands in his pockets, greeting the parents who were already occupying the plastic chairs set up along the sides of the courtyard. There were approximately 80 adults present, including mothers, fathers, and some grandparents who had come from distant neighborhoods so as not to miss the celebration. The program included folk dancing, games organized by the physical education teachers, a short play put on by the 6th graders, and a raffle for school backpacks donated by the Parents Association. Rodrigo participated in everything. He organized the sack race with his students, lost on purpose in the lemon and spoon game so that a shy boy named Sebastian could win in front of his classmates, and ate 2 cajeta jellies offered to him by the mother of a girl from the next classroom. At 12:15, with the party still in full swing, and the children scattered across the playground in noisy groups, Rodrigo approached Fernanda and told her he was going to the principal's office for a moment. He needed to pick up some documents that Principal Villanueva had asked him to sign before noon. Fernanda nodded without paying much attention. She was busy preventing 3 children from her group from climbing the playground fountain. 15 minutes passed, then 20. Fernanda scanned the crowd in the courtyard for him, but couldn't find him. She assumed the principal had kept him busy with something. 35 minutes later, as the party began to wind down and parents were picking up their children, Fernanda went to the principal's office. The secretary told her that Rodrigo had never arrived. His classroom was locked. His backpack was still hanging from the back of his chair. His cell phone, which he always carried in the right pocket of his pants, was on his desk next to a red marker and 28 bags of churros, 4 of which had never been handed out because 4 children were absent that day. Principal Villanueva called the police at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. By that time, no one at the school had seen Rodrigo Castellanos since he left the playground, telling Fernanda he was going to the principal's office. Outside on the street, The yellow and green balloons left over from the decorations were still tied to the entrance gate, swaying slowly in the warm breeze of that last day of April, as if the party didn't yet know that something had gone terribly wrong. The first officer to arrive at Benito Juarez Federal Elementary School that afternoon was Tomás Herrera Salinas of the Guanajuato Municipal Police. A 42-year-old man with the weathered face of someone who has spent too many hours under the sun of the Bajío, responding to reports that almost always have a simple explanation. He arrived at 1:20 p.m., checked Rodrigo's classroom, spoke with Principal Villanueva and Fernanda Rios, took the basic details, and filed the preliminary report as an unexcused absence with follow-up pending. It wasn't indifference, it was protocol. In most cases, people who disappear from their workplace without notice show up within hours with a mundane explanation. A personal crisis, an emergency family call, an impulsive decision. Herrera knew this from experience and acted accordingly. But the investigator who took the case the next day had a different way of reading situations. Detective Mariana Solis Aguirre had been with the Guanajuato State Attorney General's office for 11 years and had worked on disappearances of all kinds. She was 39 years old, her hair pulled back with a blue hair tie that always looked the same, and she had a habit her colleagues found disconcerting. Before speaking with any witness, she would survey the physical location for at least 20 minutes in absolute silence, as if the spaces held information that people didn't always know how to articulate. She arrived at the school at 9 in the morning on May the 1st, one day after the disappearance. The school was closed for the Labor Day holiday weekend, but Principal Villanueva opened the doors personally and accompanied her in silence as Mariana walked through the courtyard, the hallway leading to the principal's office, the third grade B classroom, and the side exit onto Pochito Street. 3 things caught her attention from the start. The first was the backpack. Rodrigo had left his backpack hanging on his chair, which ruled out any scenario of a planned departure. Someone who decides to leave takes their belongings, or at least their keys. The keys to Rodrigo's apartment were inside the backpack, in the zippered front pocket. The second was the phone. Mariana turned it on with her gloves on and checked the call history. The last incoming call had been at 11:48 a.m. the previous day, 16 minutes before Rodrigo told Fernanda he was heading to the office. The call came from a number not saved in the phone's contacts. It had lasted 4 minutes and 31 seconds. The third was the side door. The exit leading to Pochito Street had a panic bar on the inside and didn't require a key to open from the inside. Anyone could slip out that way without anyone in the courtyard noticing, as long as they chose the right moment. She immediately requested the security camera footage. The school had 4 of its own cameras installed in 2021, plus 3 additional municipal cameras distributed around the perimeter of the block as part of the Guanajuato State Urban Security Program. Mariana spent the afternoon of May 1st reviewing that footage alongside a technician from the prosecutor's office's digital division named Ernesto Paz, a quiet and meticulous young man who knew how to zoom in on images without losing useful resolution. The sequence they reconstructed was as follows. At 12:18 p.m., Rodrigo Castellanos appeared on camera number 2, which covered the interior hallway between the courtyard and the administration office. He walked at a normal pace, without hurrying, his hands at his sides. But instead of turning right toward the administration building, he continued straight down the hallway and exited through the side door onto Pochito Street. A city camera mounted on the pole at the corner of Pochitos, and Alonso recorded him at 12:19 p.m. walking along the sidewalk heading north, still wearing the blue t-shirt from the celebration. He walked at a steady pace without looking back. At 12:23 p.m., another city camera located 140 meters from the campus on Cantaranas Street captured him again. In that recording, Rodrigo was standing at the corner, facing a specific spot on the sidewalk across the street. His posture was upright, but not tense. His head was slightly tilted, His right arm moved slowly in a repeated motion, the unmistakable gesture of someone speaking to another person. Mariana asked Ernesto to zoom in on the area where Rodrigo's gaze seemed to be directed. The zoomed-in image showed an empty sidewalk, a pirul tree with low-hanging branches, the wall of a house painted ochre yellow, no people in sight. Ernesto processed the frames one by one. He verified the integrity of the file, ruling out compression artifacts and digital anomalies. The technical report he submitted 2 days later was categorical in its conclusion. The recording showed no alterations. There was no one on that section of the sidewalk. However, Rodrigo Castellanos stood at that corner for 41 seconds, maintaining what his entire body language described as a normal, unhurried conversation, with clearly differentiated turns of speaking and listening. It was not the movement of someone talking on the phone. He was not holding any visible device in his hands or wearing one in his ears. It was the posture of someone facing another person at a natural conversational distance, speaking calmly. The recording ended with Rodrigo resuming his walk northward. The next available camera, 200 meters down Alonso Street, did not capture him in any subsequent frame. Mariana watched that sequence 11 times before closing the file that night. The number from which Rodrigo had been called at 11:48 a.m. corresponded to a prepaid phone purchased at a stationery store in the historic center of Guanajuato. No identity on record, no subsequent trace of activity. The location from which the call was made, triangulated by the signal from the nearest cell tower, corresponded to the Pastita neighborhood in the northeastern part of the city, just over a kilometer from the school. It was at that moment, as she was reviewing the city map with the location marked, that Principal Villanueva, who had remained seated in silence in a corner of her own office throughout the entire meeting, said something in a low voice that completely shifted the focus of the investigation. She said it almost to herself, as if recalling something she had decided not to remember. Mariana looked up from the map. Villanueva had her hands clasped on the desk and was staring at a fixed point on the wall, a point that was no particular object, but the kind of empty space where memory projects its images when it finally gives way. 19 years ago, said the principal. It was also on Children's Day. He was also a teacher at this school, and he also disappeared from the party without anyone understanding how or why. The silence that followed in that small, tidy office, with its plants on the windowsill and its framed awards on the wall, lasted long enough for Mariana Solis to close her notebook, open it again to a blank page, and write at the top, in slow, precise handwriting, a single question. What happened at this school on April 30th, 2004? The file on the 2004 case was not at the State Attorney General's office. It was in the physical archives of the municipal police, in a storage room of the central building on Sopeña Street, inside a gray cardboard box labeled with a black marker that someone had written in cramped handwriting. Absences. April-June 2004. Mariana had it in her hands at noon on May 2nd, after 2 hours of phone calls and a personal visit to the archives area where an employee named Gilberto took 40 minutes to find the correct box among 16 others stacked in no apparent order. The man who had disappeared on April 30th, 2004, was named Aurelio Mendoza Vargas. He was 34 years old at the time. He was a fourth-grade teacher at the same Benito Juarez Federal Elementary School. He had been teaching for 6 years, and according to the 3 testimonies collected in the file, was a calm, responsible person with no known conflicts either inside or outside the school. That year's celebration had followed the same pattern as always: a decorated courtyard, games, and time spent with parents. Aurelio had been present all morning. In the early afternoon, around 3 o'clock, he left the courtyard under the pretext of going to the school storeroom to get more disposable cups. He never made it to the storeroom. He never returned to the courtyard. His car, a white 1998 Tsuru, was found 2 days later parked 4 blocks from the school on Alonso Street. with the windows closed and the doors locked. Inside, on the passenger seat, was his wallet with his ID, cash, and cards intact. There were no signs of a struggle. There was nothing to suggest violence. The 2004 investigation lasted 3 months before being suspended due to lack of evidence. There were no security cameras in the area at that time. There were no phone records providing useful information. There were no witnesses who had seen him after he left the schoolyard. Aurelio Mendoza had simply ceased to exist within the visible map of the city, and the case file was shelved with a classification that, in practice, meant the same thing as oblivion. What Mariana found at the end of the file, however, was a statement that no one had considered relevant at the time. It had been provided by the then second-grade teacher, a woman named Socorro Ibarra, who stated that in the days leading up to the disappearance, she had noticed Aurelio receiving visitors outside of school hours, always in the late afternoon, always from a man whom Socorro had never seen before at school or in the neighborhood. She described him as older than Aurelio, thin in build, with something in the way he stood, and gestured that Socorro had found strikingly familiar without being able to explain why. "They look alike," the officer had written in his notebook, quoting Socorro's words. "The lady says they look like family." Mariana read that line twice. Then she searched the file to see if anyone had followed up on that observation. No one had. That same afternoon, she tracked down Socorro Ibarra. She had left teaching in 2011 and lived in the Noria Alta neighborhood, in a small house with a cactus garden at the entrance. She was 61 years old and had a memory that time had not fundamentally eroded. When Mariana asked her about the man who visited Aurelio, Socorro didn't hesitate. She said she had seen him on 3 separate occasions, that he always arrived on foot, never by car, that their conversations took place in the school's outer hallway or on the sidewalk across the street, never inside. That Aurelio, after those visits, would return to the classroom with an expression that Socorro couldn't define precisely, but described as the face of someone who is solving something that has remained unsolved for a long time. Mariana showed her a photograph. It was an enlarged image of the frame from the Cantarana's camera, the one showing Rodrigo Castellanos standing at the corner, talking to the figure the camera hadn't captured. Socorro looked at the image for several seconds. Then she looked up and said, with a calmness that Mariana found more unsettling than any dramatic reaction, "That man in the photo, the one who appears alone. That's the same man who used to visit Aurelio." Mariana Solis returned to the district attorney's office that night with 2 names, 2 disappearances, and a witness who had just connected them in a way no case file had anticipated. What she needed now was to understand what linked Rodrigo Castellanos to Aurelio Mendoza beyond the school, the date, and the shared mystery. She requested the complete civil records for both men. Rodrigo's arrived first. He had been born in 1986 in Guanajuato City, the son of Mr. Fermín Castellanos Reyes and Mrs. Consuelo Peña de Castellanos. A middle-class family with no relevant background. But in the father's records, a detail appeared that Mariana circled. Before marrying Doña Consuelo in 1983, Fermín Castellanos had had a relationship in the city of Silao, 20 kilometers from Guanajuato. From that relationship, a son had been born in 1978, who was not legally recognized, registered solely under his mother's surname as Aurelio Mendoza Vargas. Mariana stopped writing. She read it again, slowly. Fermín Castellanos was Aurelio Mendoza's biological father, which meant that Aurelio and Rodrigo were half-brothers. 2 men raised in different cities, with different last names, unaware of each other's existence, who had ended up teaching at the same elementary school in Guanajuato 9 years apart. The question that followed was inevitable. Did they know? The answer came via Rodrigo's younger sister, Valeria Castellanos, whom Mariana reached the next day at her job, a pharmacy in the historic district. Valeria was 31 and possessed a frankness that required no beating around the bush. When Mariana asked her if Rodrigo had been in contact with anyone from the Mendoza family in recent months, Valeria answered without hesitation. Yes. About 4 months ago, Rodrigo had received a call from a man who claimed to know his father's story, a man who claimed to be his older brother. Rodrigo hadn't mentioned it to almost anyone, only to Valeria, because he needed to tell someone without it reaching his mother's ears. She had a delicate heart and a relationship with the memory of Don Fermin that wouldn't withstand that kind of truth. And how did Rodrigo react? Mariana asked. Valeria paused for a moment. Then she said that Rodrigo hadn't reacted with rejection or disbelief. He had reacted with a kind of strange relief, as if something that had always been slightly out of place in his personal history had suddenly found the missing piece. He had gone to see him several times. In Pastita. Mariana closed the notebook. Aurelio Mendoza hadn't disappeared in 2004, or at least not in the way the file suggested. Someone who had been living quietly for 19 years in a neighborhood of the same city where he had disappeared had found his younger brother, and that younger brother, on the night of Children's Day in 2023, had left the party to go see him. What Mariana still didn't know was why Aurelio had disappeared in the first place. What burden had he been carrying since 2004 that had prevented him from staying? And what was it that he had needed to tell Rodrigo so urgently that he couldn't wait until the end of the party? Those answers were in Pastita, and Mariana already knew exactly which door to knock on. The Pastita neighborhood is located in the northeastern part of Guanajuato, where the city begins to climb the hillside and the streets become narrower and quieter. The houses are painted in colors that the sun patiently fades: sage green, terracotta, old yellow, and the sidewalks are so narrow that two people can barely walk side by side. It's a neighborhood that doesn't appear in tourist guides, but has the quiet density of places where people have been living for decades without needing to announce it. Mariana arrived at 4 in the afternoon on May 3rd. She had the address she'd obtained by triangulating the signal from the prepaid phone with the phone company's records. It was a single-story house on Cantador Street, with a faded blue facade and a pot of red geraniums in the window facing the street. She knocked. She waited. She knocked again. The door opened after a long silence. The man who appeared in the doorway was 45 years old, though he looked older. He was thin, of medium height, with graying hair cut without much care, and an expression that Mariana recognized immediately because she had seen it before, in other contexts and on other people. It was the expression of someone who has been waiting so long for a visit like this that when it finally arrives, it no longer fills him with fear, but rather something akin to relief. Before Mariana could say her name, the man spoke. "I already know who you are," he said, "and I already know why you're here. Come in." Rodrigo Castellanos was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in his hands and the same blue Children's Day t-shirt, wrinkled after 3 days. He had deep, dark circles under his eyes and a stillness in his body that was not peace, but the specific exhaustion of someone who has thought too much in too short a time. When he saw Mariana enter, he nodded slightly, as if her presence were the logical conclusion of something that had begun long before he left the schoolyard. The man at the door was Aurelio Mendoza Vargas. He had been living in that house under his own name for 19 years, working as an appliance repair technician at a shop on Alonso Street, paying his bills, buying groceries at the corner store, living with the silent invisibility of someone who flees not to another place, but inward. Mariana listened to them for 2 hours. Aurelio spoke first. He did so with the slow cadence of someone who has organized a story in his head many times and knows exactly where to begin. In 2003, a year before his disappearance, Aurelio had discovered that his biological father was Fermin Castellanos. He discovered it through a letter his mother gave him when she fell ill, a letter Fermín had sent in 1985, privately acknowledging what he had never acknowledged on record: that Aurelio was his son, that he knew it, and that he felt it. Words written with the cowardice characteristic of men who confuse guilt with atonement. Aurelio had tracked down Fermín. He had discovered that he had a family in Guanajuato. He had discovered that he had a younger son named Rodrigo, who was 17 at the time, and in high school. And he had also discovered something that paralyzed him for months before he could process it. Rodrigo was studying to become a teacher, just like him. What disturbed him most was not the kinship. It was the mirror. Fermín Castellanos died in 2002, a year before Aurelio found the letter, without ever having acknowledged his eldest son in front of anyone who mattered. Aurelio carried that burden alone for a whole year. And when the weight became too much, on the night of Children's Day in 2004, instead of going back for the disposable cups, he walked out of the school and didn't return. Not because he had made a rational decision, but because at that moment his body simply couldn't find its way back. He had thought many times about looking for Rodrigo. He had put it off for years with reasons that over time became less and less convincing. Until in January 2023, he picked up the phone and dialed. Rodrigo spoke afterward. He said that the visits to Pastita in the months leading up to the party had been the most difficult and most necessary conversations of his life. That Aurelio had told him everything: the letter, Fermín's silence, the 19 years in that blue house. And that on the morning of Children's Day, when Aurelio called him on the phone saying he needed to see him that very day, that there was something he hadn't been able to tell him during any of the previous visits, and that he couldn't keep to himself any longer. Rodrigo had made a decision without thinking too much about it. What was it that Aurelio needed to tell him? Mariana asked. Aurelio and Rodrigo looked at each other for a second before either of them answered. It was Aurelio who spoke, in a voice that had lost all the weight of the weight, that he didn't regret having looked for him, that finding him had been the first time in 19 years that he'd felt like he was making amends. Not for what his father had broken, but for what he himself had broken by disappearing, and that he needed to tell him in person, just once, before Rodrigo built his life moving forward without knowing there was someone who'd known him before he even knew himself. Rodrigo hadn't planned to stay 3 days. He'd planned an hour. But when he walked into that kitchen and Aurelio began to speak, time stopped flowing in its usual way. Mariana jotted down the time in her notebook, stood up, and called the district attorney's office to report that Rodrigo Castellanos had been located alive. Outside, on Cantador Street, the May sun fell on the colorful facades with that golden horizontal light of Guanajuato afternoons, and the red geraniums in the window were still there, exactly where they had been for 19 years, without anyone in the neighborhood ever having thought to ask who lived behind them. What followed was long, as truths that have waited too long to come out always are. Rodrigo answered questions for 2 days at the State Attorney General's office. He did so calmly and with a precision that Detective Solis noted in her report as that of someone who has nothing to hide but much to explain. He confirmed every detail: the January phone call, the visits to Pastita, the impulsive decision on Children's Day. He signed the relevant documents and was released without charges on the afternoon of May 5th. Aurelio faced a more complex situation. His disappearance in 2004 had not technically constituted a crime. No law requires an adult to remain where they were. But the reopening of the case and the review of the circumstances took several weeks. In the end, the matter was resolved administratively, without criminal proceedings, given the passage of time and the absence of direct harm to third parties. Fernanda Rios, Rodrigo's colleague, who had been the last to see him leave the courtyard, welcomed him back to school 3 weeks later with a mixture of relief and reproach that Rodrigo accepted without defending himself. Principal Villanueva didn't say much. She just looked at him for a long moment as he walked through the principal's office door to hand in his reinstatement papers, and then nodded once, as if closing a parenthesis that had been open for too long. The person for whom the resolution of the case was hardest to process wasn't inside the school. Her name was Elena Fuentes Bravo. She was 42 years old and had been Aurelio's partner until 2002, 2 years before his disappearance. They had lived together for 3 years in a neighborhood south of the city. When Aurelio disappeared in 2004, Elena spent months assisting with the investigation, answering questions, reviewing photographs, waiting for calls that never came. She rebuilt her life over time, as one always does, with the uneven slowness of someone who doesn't choose to heal but simply keeps on living. When Mariana contacted her to inform her that Aurelio was alive and had been in Guanajuato all that time, Elena didn't respond immediately. There was a silence on the phone for several seconds that Mariana didn't try to fill. Then Elena asked just one thing. "Is he okay?" Mariana replied that he was. Elena said she needed a few days. She didn't ask for more information. She didn't ask why or where or how. She only asked for time, and Mariana understood without needing anyone to explain it. Aurelio and Elena never saw each other again, at least not during the period this investigation was able to document. Some distances, even if measured in a 20-minute drive, carry a weight that cannot be resolved by a reunion. Rodrigo returned to the third-grade B classroom one Monday in May, under the clear Guanajuato sky, after the first rains of the storm. His students greeted him with the natural commotion of 28 children who didn't quite understand what had happened, but who recognized that their teacher had been absent and was now back. Sebastian, the shy boy who had won the Children's Day race, saved him a candy wrapped in cellophane that he'd been carrying in his uniform pocket since the party. Rodrigo took it, unwrapped it slowly, and ate it before class began. Aurelio continued living in the blue house in Pastita. He kept repairing appliances in the workshop on Alonso Street. What changed was something not recorded in any file. He no longer carried alone the story his father had left incomplete. There was someone else who knew it. And that, though it doesn't solve anything, carries a different weight when shared. At Benito Juarez Federal Elementary School, the playground where Children's Day is celebrated every year, remained just as it always had. The same grey tiles, the same flagpole in the center, the same fountain that the children try to climb and that no teacher can fully keep an eye on. 2 teachers had left that playground on 2 different Children's Days, searching for something the school couldn't give them. Both had returned, each in their own way, each in their own time. And the playground was still there, seemingly without memory, ready for next year's celebration.